So next, in our slightly altered order of events, we have Costantino Moretti. Costantino is an associate professor in Chinese medieval Buddhism and Dunhuang studies at the École Française d'Extrême Orient, and he obtained his PhD in East Asian studies from the École Pratique des Hautes Études, where he was a research associate as well until 2017. His main fields of interest are Dunhuang manuscripts and mural paintings, and he organizes an annual cycle of conferences in Paris in collaboration with the Dunhuang Academy. And since 2013, Costantino has taught on Chinese manuscripts traditions at the École Pratique des Hautes Études. His recent publications include his book, Genèse d'un apocryphe bouddhique, and he co-edited the incredible volume La Fabrique de l'Isibylle with Jean-Pierre Drège. And he's also a sub-editor for the Encyclopedia of Manuscript Cultures in Asia and Africa, as am I. Costantino, very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for this kind of introduction. So to start, I would like to thank Melody, who kindly invited me to take part to this conference, which is of great interest to me, even if I'm not really a specialist of the Lotus Sutra, and also to Sia and the organizers and the members of the staff who organized this beautiful conference. So today I will be talking about the layout and formal organization of the Lotus Sutra in manuscript form. And more precisely, I would like to focus on three particular aspects. So to begin with, I will set forth a few observations regarding some of the earliest copies of this text. And second, I will discuss some specific points regarding different types of scroll divisions attested in Dunhuang manuscripts. And to finish, I will highlight a few more things concerning a group of late manuscripts containing various major textual units of this scripture in one single scroll. So, as you know, the translation of this scripture by Dharmaraksha is found in a very limited number of copies in the Dunhuang manuscripts. And there is a total of 10 manuscripts, as far as I know, in the four major collections. And this number is even less consistent if we consider that some of them are most likely fragments of the same scroll. And this is quite clear if, for example, we put together these two manuscripts of the British Library and these two manuscripts kept in the Chinese collection. This hypothesis is suggested by the characteristics of the paper and even more by the text blocks themselves, which match perfectly. And even more interesting, these four manuscripts are relatively late. They date back to the 7th or 8th century, when the translation by Dharmaraksha was already very obsolete. And four other manuscripts, which may also belong to a same scroll set, are written in this archaic writing style, including this copy of the British collection on your left. This writing style is attested in manuscripts dating back to the 5th century. A few early copies of this scripture were also found in the region of Turfan during the Otani expeditions. These documents are of great interest due to the characteristics of the layout, and in particular the formal presentation of versified passages which provide evidence of a specific organization of the text in an early phase. This copy dates back to the 6 dynasties. As you can see, the sheets are structured in horizontal lines which divide the writing space into 4 uniformly sized registers, one above the other. Most likely this layout was meant to facilitate the conceptual division of metrical units. It served the same role of punctuation, which is provided by blanks in other scriptures containing verses. The layout had various advantages when it came to reading, understanding, and structuring versified text. And the same type of layout is found in some of the earliest manuscripts found in Dunhuang and containing verses, containing versified passages, in particular in early copies of the Chinese Dharmapada, such as this manuscript of the Paleo collection on your left, which is considered one of the oldest documents in the entire collection. But this element is even more interesting in these copies of the Lotus Sutra, because it's quite clear that the 4 registers are drawn only in the section of the manuscript where verses appear and not throughout the entire manuscript. As you can see in these pictures, the columns that precede or follow are not divided into frames. And we can observe more clearly the same phenomenon in an early copy of this scripture, in this case Kumarajiva's translation found in Kucha. This copy dates back to the Western Liang, 412 most likely, that is to say very close to the date of the translation of this scripture by Kumarajiva in 404 or 405. And concerning this type of layout, we even know one extreme case. This is not a copy of the Lotus Sutra, but an interesting example anyway, in which the scribe or the individual responsible for structuring the manuscript layout has traced these lines for one single column containing verses. And one may wonder if this element was strictly necessary in this case. So this page layout, which allowed a better visual organization and comprehension of these parts of the text, was relatively complex. It needed extra preliminary work, and its nature and precise function is still part of my current research. In any case, it is clear that this specific layout was abandoned and no longer in vogue in later periods. To the best of my knowledge, no clearly dated manuscripts featuring this format were produced after the 5th century. So this characteristic is also a codicological element that can facilitate hypothesis as to a date range in which a given document was produced. Now I will make some observations concerning scroll divisions in the Lotus Sutra with a focus on Kumarajiva's translation. And my observations are based on the paper published by Jean-Pierre Drège in La Fabrique du Lisible, which has inspired me to formulate a number of further considerations. So if you are familiar with sources referred to as Chinese catalogues of Buddhist scriptures, you probably know that these sources speak of a 7 or 8 scroll version of this sutra. However, in Dunhuang, the 10 scroll version is also attested. So here you have a slide showing the arrangement of its chapters in these 3 versions with an indication of approximately the number of characters contained in each section to have an idea of the volume of each scroll. So the content is the same, the number of chapters is the same, the number of scrolls and their organization are different. So the 10 and 8 scroll versions would seem to circulate during the Nambai Chao period, while the 7 scroll version during the Tang. For example, here you have 2 versions in 10 scrolls dating back to the 5th or 6th century, and another fragment of the 6th century that can be identified only as a 10 scroll version. And finally, this fragment of the 7th or 8th century, which corresponds only to a 8 scroll version based on its chapters and scroll divisions. So, given choices in the formal organization of a scripture may be linked to material factors or to specific standards or trends in some historical periods, when we compare information found in early catalogues of Buddhist scriptures to later sources, certain differences in the structure of various texts come to light, indicating that given scriptures were circulating in several formats, possibly with a different layout, and scroll divisions evolved over the centuries before possibly stabilizing at a certain point in the complex history of this religious system. That is to say that at some point, one version of a given text composed of a specific number of scrolls is defined as normative. But are these differences due to the textual evolution of a scripture or to the evolution of standards in manuscript production? Let's say a sort of standardization process which resulted in the identification of a normative format that in some cases has modified the formal organization of early scriptures. And this is an important question. Well, there would seem to be some cases in which both the theoretical and the material aspects are taken into account in shaping a manuscript. At least to a certain extent, the structure of the Lotus Sutra in 8 scrolls would seem to be linked to specific religious practices that were highlighted in particular in the domain of Japanese studies. The version in 8 scrolls is very popular in Japan, while in China the 7-scroll version is mentioned in most catalogues. And when I say religious practices, I'm talking about ceremonial lectures given in memorial contexts that were originally held, at least in Japan, over a period of 4 days with 2 lecture sessions every day. So these lectures were linked, at least in early attested sources, to memorial services for the dead, but also intended for religious edification. And in Japan, this practice is known as the 8 lectures on the lotus. As mentioned by Professor Jean-Noël Robert, late Japanese sources consider the 8-scroll version a sort of Japanese creation due to the Buddhist master Gonzo. However, as noted by Professor Bernard Franck, the 8-scroll version was already circulating in China at the end of the 6th century. So is the opinion of Professor Bernard Franck and others that this division in 8 codicological units was produced due to a specific need for symmetry with the above-mentioned religious practices involving 8 preaching sessions in order to make one scroll for each preaching session. And the idea of structuring readings of the Lotus in 8 sessions most likely previously existed in China. A number of hagiographical accounts highlight this division issue. One of them is found in a source dated 754. This interesting anecdote involves a monk named Hui Ming and a blind monkey who obtained to be reborn in heaven for having listened to someone preaching the lotus. This heavenly being asked the monk to give lectures on the lotus in 8 sessions, just as Shakyamuni did it in 8 years. So in this story, the monk Hui Ming only had the version in 7 scrolls, and as such, he divided it in 8 scrolls. And of course, these are just anecdotes, but despite their hagiographical nature, they reflect, I believe, an actual debate concerning this subdivision issue, which is explained via specific religious practices. The Dunhuang manuscripts, where different standards in the general conceptual organization of the sutra are mixed up together, are of great interest. On the one hand, they show a tendency to repair, to reuse fragments of obsolete manuscripts, and on the other hand, a tendency to adapt a given standard format to a new standard formats. And various documents suggest given tendencies in considering the 7 or the 8 scroll version as normative in specific historical periods. For example, this manuscript Stein 504, probably dating back to the 7th century, is a good example. If we take a look at the anatomy of this manuscript, we can see some interesting things that catch our attention. The standard for the number of columns per sheet is easy to identify, 28 columns. We do not need to consider the first and the last sheets because they are always different from the others for obvious reasons. On the other hand, there would seem to be something odd at one point. Sheet number 14 contains only 12 columns, and sheets number 15 only 27. So just looking at these figures, it is clear that there is a problem at this point of the manuscript. Now the scroll begins with chapter 20, and the number 7 is written right below the title here. These numbers, as you know, are always found at the beginning of one scroll and indicate the scroll number as in these three examples. So this suggests that we are dealing with the beginning of the 7th scroll in the 8th scroll version, which is the only version in which the 7th scroll starts at this point. And then the text continues until the end of chapter 23, and it is precisely at this point that we find the abnormal sheet containing 12 columns. This section corresponds to the beginning of chapter 24, and under the title we find again the number 7, suggesting in this case the beginning of the 7th scroll of the Lotus Sutra, but in 7 scrolls, the last scroll in this version, which starts precisely at this point. So it would seem to be the initial part of another manuscript, presumably a copy of the Lotus Sutra in 7 scrolls, pasted to the previous one. And the scroll stops at the end of this chapter, as in the version in 8 scrolls, so we can argue that these are 2 fragments of the Lotus Sutra in 2 different formats that were combined together and transformed into an 8-scroll version, which was presumably considered the normalized format by the individual who produced this manuscript. So manuscripts providing evidence of eclectic assembling of different standards are not uncommon in Dunhuang and should be analyzed to get more information on this topic. Here you have another example from the British Library, but I am not presenting it today. And now, the last part of my talk, Professor Fujieda Akira has defined one category of Dunhuang manuscripts as scrolls in small characters, because these documents do not correspond to the format that we assume to be intended for official monastic libraries, as they do not observe the famous 17-character column standard, but may contain more than 40 characters per column, which results in a high page density. And various copies of the Lotus Sutra belong to this category with this layout. Instead of dividing the scripture in 7, 8, or 10 separate scrolls, it was possible to make fit one complete copy of this text in 1 or 2 individual scrolls. So these types of manuscripts, even if we consider them as a distinct category, are not very standardized. For example, the number of characters per column can vary from 20 to 45. There is no evidence of a given rule or a trend in the formal organization, and this would seem to suggest a production carried out in a specific context, maybe for an individual or personal use. And there is at least one source mentioning a formal request presented by a member of the religious hierarchy asking to integrate one scripture in this format into the library of a given monastery due to the fact that the collection of this monastery was incomplete. This information is found in a manuscript of the British collection dated 964, and the request concerns, in this case, a copy of the Cuishen Wangjing, or Sutra of the Golden Light. Another interesting document of the same type is this manuscript kept at the British Museum. It contains a sketch for a painting with a group of worshipping individuals. And on the verso, there is a list of scriptures also making reference to a copy of the Lotus Sutra structured in 2 parts, Shang and Xia, providing evidence that this scripture could be structured into codicological units. However, various examples found in Dunhuang would seem to suggest a different scenario, that is to say that in some cases a complete copy of the Lotus was copied into one single scroll. In fact, it is difficult to provide evidence for such a conclusion because most of the copies that we have today are very fragmentary, but we can notice that a number of them, for example, contain the text of scrolls number 3, 4, and 5 copied all together into the same scroll, which makes it unlikely, I think, that someone would have copied the rest of the text, that is to say scrolls 6 and 7, for example, in another separate and much smaller scroll. And here you have 3 examples. The first one is in the Chinese collection and contains scroll running from number 1 to number 4, but the manuscript continued. And the second example, also from the Chinese National Library, containing scrolls number 3, 4, and 5. The beginning and the end of this manuscript are missing. And then you have this Stein 640 containing scrolls 5, 6, and 7, but the beginning is missing again. And then you have this beautiful copy kept at the Tokyo National Museum, dating back to the Tang Dynasty, 694. You can even see some special characters dating back to the reign of Wu Zetian on your left in the colophon, and it's a complete copy of the Lotus Sutra in one single scroll. So the context of production and the nature of these types of manuscripts can be debated. What is relatively clear, I think, is that this format had a number of advantages in terms of practical use. These types of manuscripts are easier to carry around because they contain in one single material object a relatively long text, typically divided in 7 or 8 separate codicological units. So by considering this aspect, we can formulate hypotheses concerning their function and use. And another interesting thing, these manuscripts found in Dunhuang are all relatively late. As far as I can see, most of them date to the 8th or 9th century. I would say not prior to the Tibetan rule. So at first sight, one could consider this phenomenon as something specific to that context. But in fact, earlier sources also make short mentions to texts written in this format. For example, the famous Chu Sanzanjiji by Seng Yo, who makes reference to copies of the Sutra of Vimalakirti written in big or small characters, 大字细字为摩诘经, and the Gao Sang Juan speaks of Sishu, which must be interpreted as small end writing. And here I quote a passage translated by Pietro de Laurentiis in his recent book. So all these elements would seem to confirm that this practice was known in earlier phases of manuscript production and also in central China, of course. Moreover, by analyzing the textual organization of some of these copies, we also figure out that they tend to reproduce somehow the characteristics of the manuscript which served as an antigraph. For example, we find technical instructions like the scroll number, as well as end titles indicating the end of each scroll in the source manuscript. It is also clear that blank spaces were used to represent column breaks found in the source manuscripts. And these elements tie back to the question of knowing to what degree these copies reproduced the visual and paratextual elements found in the reference manuscripts, and at the same time they allow to make hypotheses on genetic links between different manuscripts. I think I repeated it many times this year in various conferences, but while largely underestimated by modern scholars as not being part of the text proper, paragraph divisions made by line breaks are important elements to define filiation between witnesses and establish the genealogy of a group of manuscripts, as you can see from these examples. For example, if we compare these two manuscripts, the left one is in small characters and the right one is a standard copy. We can see there would not seem to be links between these two manuscripts, but in the second case, there is some kind of filiation based on formal characteristics, even if one is in small characters and the other one is a standard copy. So I guess my time is running out, so I go to general conclusions that concern the 3 points that I have discussed today. All the examples I have analyzed show how important it is to take into account a series of non-textual elements, layout, textual divisions, and paratextual elements to retrace the genealogy of a group of a scripture in manuscript form and its ties with specific branches of a textual tradition. So given the very large number of copies of the Lotus Sutra in the various collections of Dunhuang manuscripts, a comprehensive study with this specific approach would be more than pertinent, I believe, and would probably bring interesting results, I think. And that's all I have for you today. Thanks for your attention.